Thank you so much for having me. UC Irvine has kind of welcomed me with open arms. I'm still continually fascinated by the work of the School of Social Ecology, what it's meant, what it does, the way it approaches the world, the way it makes a difference, and it's really an honor to kind of help be a part, however small, of highlighting the work that you all do in the research phase and the practitioner phase, and I'm continually intrigued by it. So thank you again for the opportunity of being able to work with you guys. Dean Gould, thank you personally for everything. Eloy, our friendship goes for not too many, I don't want to go how many years back, but you've been a great advocate for not just higher education and our students, but for our Latino community broadly. And thank all of you for making the time this morning. I want to talk a little bit about today this country, this extraordinary transformation our country is going through. I want to talk about what it's going to mean and what life, I think, will look like, not just for the country and the way that it is changing, but for Latinos and the whole idea of Latinidad, of being Latino, Latina, Latinx, however we determine to define ourselves and challenge ourselves going forward, because our community is changing as much or more than the country's complexion and culture is changing. And that's really the premise of the book, is kind of an examination of who we are, who we have been and how we got here, but perhaps most importantly, the area of focus that I like to see with our communities, where are we going? And who's going to define that? And what does it mean? And whether we as a community are at a point finally, certainly places like California, where we are no longer viewing ourselves as a minority, because we are not, but we are viewing ourselves as the stewards of power, as at least when it comes to policy making, to change the direction of our community and change the futures of where we are headed. It's great to be at UC Irvine because more than any other, you see the diversity that is represented here is an honor to be affiliated with that. And Orange County specifically has some very, very unique dynamics that I think are going to change and accelerate all of these concepts that I'm talking about in a way that are not just unique for the state, but I think are going to be predictive for where the country is heading, because not just the diversity for diversity's sake, but because of the rate at which so many people of color, Latinos specifically, are attending and graduating from higher education. I've long been an advocate of our community college system because that has so often been that place of first resort for people like me, a second, third, or even a fourth chance at fixing and turning around your life. But UCs, of course, are that crown jewel. They are that highest part of our higher education system, and to see the changing complexion of our student body is indicative of where our future is heading, who's going to be leading nonprofits, who's going to be leading in the C-suites, who's going to be leading in academia, and perhaps, from my perspective, because of my own biases, who's going to be leading our political discourse. So let me kind of start, as I sometimes do, with some of the more provocative stuff. My goal is to hopefully make you all a little bit uncomfortable in some way, shape, or form. If I've done that, then I've been successful. It's always nice to do that before or during breakfast. Want to dispel, I think, a few of the stereotypes that are so common about our community so that we can, I think, get a little bit perhaps more of a better perspective of where we are headed. The first is, many of us know that there's an explosive population transformation going on. We just surpassed African Americans as the largest ethnic group in the voter rolls in this country in 2020, and we are hitting a point of really rapid acceleration now. For the first time in my history, 30-year history as a political professional, Latinos and the Latino vote will be larger than the margins of victory in every one of the 7 swing states in the country. So we are no longer kind of a marginal Texas, California, Florida, maybe New York, and a little bit of a New Mexico dynamic. It is literally in every single swing state where we are looking at and getting daily calls from reporters about what this is going to mean. In Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, there are more Latino voters now, by the way, in Wisconsin than there are African American voters as well. North Carolina, keep your eyes on North Carolina. I keep saying that, but I think Latinos are going to really move North Carolina in a different direction in the next 45, 50 days, however many days are left in this election. We have the largest gender gap of any race or ethnicity in the country. Our men are largely responsible for this shift towards the Republican Party that we've witnessed over the past 10 years. Our women are increasingly voting with and affiliating with the Democratic Party. I correlate that almost directly with what we call the diploma divide. The diploma divide is the single largest demarcation of any political indicator that we have in this country right now, where those with a college degree are rapidly moving towards the Democratic Party, those that do not are rapidly moving towards the Republican Party. And if you haven't connected the dots yet, we as a Latino community have the largest diploma divide of any race or ethnicity as well. In fact, the diploma divide and the political gender gap are virtually identical, about a 7-point spread and growing. So our women are, again, increasingly going to college at rates faster than our men. And we see that manifesting, especially in places like California, where we have more Latinas elected to our legislature than Latinos, or more women. In fact, we also elect women at a higher rate than any other race or ethnicity. Which is, I think, not a surprising cultural characteristic for those of us that grew up in, I'm going to say Latina homes, because we all know that our mothers are the head of the household. And women have long been a part of our culture, looked to for social leadership, community leadership, change agents, and certainly now political change and political leadership. This is not new to us. Even Mexico now has, right, a woman president as a leader of the country. And I say that because the Latinization of America, as I call it, will also lead to what I believe is going to be, for lack of a better term, a feminization of America. And by feminization, what I mean is a more female perspective and outlook on the world, a more female approach to problem solving and finding policy solutions. And I think that's probably very long overdue. I also want to make it clear this is not a blue state phenomenon. It's not particular to one party. We see almost near parity in states like Texas in terms of male-female Latino representation. Florida is pretty close. New Jersey is like 70% of the Hispanic representation is female. Even in states like Utah, the leaders of both houses in the state legislature are Latinas. So as we watch this unfold and we watch this diploma divide get bigger and bigger, it will have extraordinary ramifications on all of our institutions. And by institutions, I mean all of those things that we come together and believe in as human beings that we commonly agree are either necessary or important or serve some function in helping our society move forward. Whether it's higher education, like UCI where we're at today, or the media, which has come under so much scrutiny by certain elements of our society, the government, which of course has long been kind of the subject and object of ire from the American right, but also the church community, the military, corporations. There's been a broad decline of support and trust and faith in the institutions that keep this idea of democracy, as we call it, together. In fact, you can't have a democracy, you can't have a society without a common belief in institutions. You don't have to necessarily like the outcomes. You can continually fight for reform or change of those institutions, but when you believe those institutions need to be torn down, or that they've been partisanized the way that they have in our current climate, and perhaps worse, that certain institutions literally exist to harm your way of life, or threaten your view of the world, you're on very precarious ground as both a country and as a nation. And that's precisely where we find ourselves at this moment in time. The age group that has the largest percentage turnout, not just now at this moment, but pretty much always, are those 60 and older. Unfortunately, there's nobody 60 and older in this room, so I'm going to talk about that. the generation of Americans that are over 60 years of age or older have been the beneficiaries of perhaps the culmination of the 25 American generations before it. It's the wealthiest, most privileged generation America has ever produced. They have spent most of their life and times living at a time of relative U.S. global hegemony, where we are the sole U.S. superpower. There have been conflicts during their times, most notably the Vietnam War, which was a definitive formative experience. And there was also this long, protracted war in the Middle East that nobody knew was going on. But this group, despite all of that, has the most negative view of this country and our institutions of any generation ever researched in the history of modern polling. They've essentially given up on the idea of America. At least half of them believe that it's not worth keeping anymore and are more than willing to overthrow the government if they don't like the outcomes of things like elections, through violent means if necessary. And this presents itself as one of the most, I think, challenging moments of our time and of our day. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those under 30, especially Latinos, and when you say under 30 and Latino, it's almost synonymous because that's how fast and extraordinary the change is happening, have among the highest levels of trust and confidence in our social institutions, despite having far less reasons to believe in it, believe in them, despite having far fewer history and far less a rosy picture of what America is. The belief in the American idea is most pronounced and positive with this demographic. Now, some of this is a function of age. Y'all under 30 just haven't been beaten up enough to know better. But that need to believe in the idea of this country and our institutions are ultimately what carries it forward. America is an idea. And it has always been easy to say that it is an idea when there's never been a demographic challenge to the power structure. For 250 years, we have been a white country by 85%. There have been challenges. The Irish weren't considered white for a long time, nor were the Italians. And over time, they would assimilate into this great melting pot, as Theodore Roosevelt called it in the early 1900s, this idea of a new nation, of a new people, pulled together culturally by an idea. That kind of works up until you start becoming a non-white people. And in that regards, California has a lot of lessons to teach us. Learned a lot of good things in the 1990s about what that could be. Learned a lot of bad things about what that meant. And a lot of those lessons that I returned from the East Coast when I was doing my undergraduate to watch firsthand and be a part of is now part of the practice that I'm engaged in as we watch the entire country go through this transformative process of becoming a non-white country, which we will be in about 15 years. For the first time in our history, most Americans will not come from a white, European, overwhelmingly Christian perspective in the way that they view the world. Going west, young man, which has been so formative in our ideas of frontier and opportunity, will be replaced by people who look north and are now looking east for American opportunity and American ideas. The whole concept of frontier is going to change. That will change California. That will change this country. And it will happen about mid-century, which is why I titled the book The Latino Century. Not just because of the demographic change, not just because of the shrinking share of the white population or the rise of the Latino population, but because the very thing that ails us most as a democracy in this country and our politics at this time is literally day by day being refreshed by a people turning 18, one every 30 seconds. That brings a new confidence, a new trust, a new belief in what this country has always stood for. And so in many ways, my book argues we're in a demographic foot race between an older generation who no longer believes in America, who believes its best days are behind it, who believes that because it has failed them and no longer looks like them, that we are at a time where America's gone anyway, so we might as well just decide who our election victors are going to be through means of violence and through insurrectionist behavior. I'm certainly not ascribing those qualities to everyone involved with my party, but I'm certainly shocked and alarmed by the amount of support that that action continues to call behind it and be followed by. And so for me personally, in many ways, this book was about that tension. This party that used to stand for the ideas of what I believe constitutionalism always meant to the party, the ideas that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and the reality of what happens when that all doesn't look like y'all, doesn't look like us. And that's a big part of the tension that America is going through right now. There's a wide swath of America believes that if we are not a white Christian nation, then we are not in America at all. And we are hearing that, not in dog whistles, not in subtlety, but in overt expression directly through the rhetoric of the campaigns of the nominee Republican Party for the President of the United States. To me, that's not just a battle of ideas, it's a battle, it's an existential battle of who America is, who Americans are, what America is, what this whole idea, this whole American experiment was launched to be and become. So, I can go on all day, John. I don't know how long you want me to talk for. I know we are going to have a discussion about this a little bit more, but we're also, I think I'm trying to make it as interactive as we can because we do want to take some questions. Am I too short on this, or do you want me to wrap it down?
A little bit more.
Keep going on a little bit longer? All right, well, buckle up. Let's get going. Let me put a couple more things. One of the basic arguments I make in the book is that the rapid explosion of Latino voters is happening predominantly with now a third, and this is fascinating to someone like me who's been looking at this for 3 decades, a discernible fourth generation Latino voter. 80% of the growth of Latinos in this country are happening amongst the US born. And these US born voter and their idea of Latinidad and Latino identity is 180 degrees different than the first and second generations that came before them. And I first recognized this as an undergraduate when I was writing my senior thesis at Georgetown University. The politicization of the migrant who comes here and naturalizes is an entirely different experience than their sons and daughters, the second generation. But as distinct and different as those are, the move from first to second is not nearly as tectonic as the move from second to third. By the third generation, especially with Mexican Americans, the English language is not only exclusive in most cases, overwhelming cases, it's not dominant, it becomes exclusive. Less than 2% of third generation Latinos consume media in Spanish mediums. Less than 2%. Let me make this really clear. 80% of the growth that is happening is US born, most of that third and now fourth generation. So some of the stereotypes that we have been using both in politics and in our media are not only not accurate, but every day they're becoming less and less accurate. What we have also found is the movement between that second and third generation voter is really the crucible that is crossed between the racial and ethnic identity voter compelled by issues like immigration and immigration reform and or border security towards an economic pocketbook voter who is overwhelmingly consumed in telling pollsters and researchers that affordability, things like housing, job opportunity, and upward mobility are where they want their politicians to focus. But never in my 3 decades of doing this have I heard either party articulate what that agenda would look like. What is a Latino economic agenda and why does it matter? And every time that it's brought up, the conversation almost ultimately revolves or devolves back into the immigrant experience. That doesn't mean that I don't have a deep affinity, a deep abiding affinity for our immigrants. I just spent the first half of this talk speaking about not just the economic value, but the cultural value, the cultural necessity of having Latinos reinvigorate the American idea. I don't think this country can last much longer, I'm arguing, without a cultural infusion of people who believe in this country. And fortunately, we are witnessing that every day. But I'm also not going to be blind to the data that Latinos are changing. Latino voters are changing dramatically. 38% of our voters are under the age of 30 years old. Almost 40% of our voters are under the age of 30. Now, for an old guy like me, even 30 seems like a long time ago. But for those over 30, and I know there's just a handful of us in that room that meet that criteria, to put it in perspective, Proposition 187 was placed on the ballot, started by signature gatherers here in Orange County 30 years ago this year. 30 years ago. So let me say this a little bit more cleanly. Almost 40% of Latino voters were not alive during Proposition 187. They have no living memory of that formative moment in Latino politics. I know that makes a lot of us feel old and a little uncomfortable in the room because it was such a big deal for most of our lives, but almost 40% of our voters have no living memory of it. So the whole notion of a racialized voting bloc is somewhat foreign to these voters. And when we start to see activity like the executive action that Joe Biden just signed on shutting down the border by restricting asylum applicants, essentially shutting the border down. 69% of Latino voters supported that, compared to 70% of voters overall. There's virtually no difference. That's why you're not seeing this visceral pushback. Kamala Harris, the nominee of the Democratic Party now, before she officially accepted it at the Democratic National Convention, launched her campaign with an ad calling for thousands of new border enforcement officers, photos of her along the border wall with officers, talking in strenuous terms about her history of prosecuting transnational gangs and shutting down fentanyl. She has now accepted, as orthodox in the Democratic Party, the conservative Republican position of the Langford bill. We can call it a bipartisan bill all we want, but that bill was basically one of the most conservative senators in the United States conservative senators in the U.S. walking into the Oval Office and saying, these are my demands, and Joe Biden saying, okay, we'll accept it. That was the deal. That was the deal. And this is not a criticism, by the way. The politics were smart, and I'm going to say why it was smart, is because Latino voters agree with it. And that's a very profound change for a lot of folks in this room and in this country as Latinos who came of age at a very different time, try to figure out what has changed in our community. The biggest change has been an explosion of third and fourth generation voters who are focused and concerned about the economic populism and the extraordinary stresses of making rent and paying the mortgage and being allowed to, or being capable of signing up their kids for soccer this season as their priority. The irony is that has always been the case, but it is becoming less so as migration levels begin to decline, and I'm going to leave you on this one last data point. That is it. Los Angeles County feels like a universe away. I know when you're in the OC, but just to the north of us, LA County, the largest Latino county in the country. In 2002, 54% of new Latino voter registrations were those of the foreign born, of immigrants. 54% of Latinos who registered, naturalized, became voters were from another country. In 2022, during the last midterms, that number had dropped to 8%. Brought this up to a group of Latino mayors. This is 20 years, just a complete collapse. I spoke with a group of mayors a few weeks ago at the League of California Cities. A lot of those Latino mayors in, Huntington Park, Bell, came up to me afterwards and said, I'd never heard that data point, but all of the immigration clinics that we used to run for 10 or 20 years, we can't find people to attend them anymore. there aren't people to come anymore. But what we are finding is their children and grandchildren, we've had to switch to English to have them, learn to become civically engaged and voter participation and voter participants, and they're motivated by an entirely different set of issues. And that's happening everywhere. Ironically, it happened in other parts of the country first, but now California, and this is very curious, but in the single largest ethnic demographic change in the history of this country, California was a lagging indicator. It was an outlier that confounded both parties, and it is just now catching up. So for the second time, I'm going to say, let me wrap up with this. Orange County finds itself at the vanguard, the forefront of yet another change, because we are witnessing, literally every year, a higher rate of graduation from college by Latinos, all non-white races and ethnicities, by the way. And that is leaning into this diploma divide dynamic that I mentioned earlier. And so for the first time, we can see communities where race and ethnicity is the driving factor towards politicization. We can see second generation voters, even of Asian or Vietnamese communities specifically, and Latinos changing towards a different party affiliation by that second generation. And now that third generation, when we're seeing higher rates of college, oftentimes switching back. And so there's a unique laboratory here in this county going on, where we can actually look and seek to identify what is it that people in this very pluralistic, diverse society are voting on. How are they seeing the world? Are they seeing it as a racialized ethnic immigrant? Are they seeing it as a working class son and daughter of that immigrant? Or are they seeing it as an upwardly mobile, highly educated, increasingly civic-minded, college degree person of color? All of that is exactly what this country is going to be in 20 years, what is happening here and now. So with that, we'll go ahead and do our discussion and take some questions.
So as you think of questions, let me start with a few thank yous. So the first thank you, of course, goes to Eloy, who introduced me to Mike. Eloy sits on the Dean's Leadership Council for the School of Social Ecology. And I was talking to him about how the school always wants to be engaged in important issues of the day, and who is it that I should be meeting as a new dean. He said, well, there's this guy, Mike Madrid, you might want to go meet. So we talked on Zoom for a few minutes with you in your ubiquitous black t-shirt in front of your giant picture of Abraham Lincoln. And then we met for lunch up in Sacramento. We'd never met each other before, and we hit it off, and I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that you have agreed to be associated with the School of Social Ecology. The other group to thank is the UC Alliance. So Mike has talked about the changing demographics of higher education. The Alliance's origin is proof of that alone here at UCI. For those of us who are old enough, the notion that UCI would become a Hispanic-serving institution because we have that many students who are Latina is really remarkable, and it is no more true than in the School of Social Ecology, where almost half of our students are Latino. So it makes this Anglo honorary Latino very proud. The third person to thank is Todd Priest, who is a former professional friend of yours. I was about to say former friend. You've held on to a number of friends as you work with the Lincoln Project. Yeah. We can thank Todd for the books here. Every single one of these books today is free for you, and Mike will stick around to sign them for you. So with all of that as an intro and as a thank you, let's see what questions are on your mind. We have a microphone back here that we can take around, and Trace, why don't you start right there where you are?
I'm Juan Ortega with the UC Alliance. So question for you. First of all, thank you for all that wonderful data that you provided. Amazing. Obviously, being Latino, I'm very biased here. But so my question to you is, given the backdrop of the United States, with even going back even further, in with its history of looking at African Americans not even perceived as full citizens, as women not even having the right to vote until 100 years ago, given the civil rights movement only 50 plus years ago. And then with that, the fact that Latin American countries, there's machismo, there's still racism, there's still classism in those countries that we bring, our immigrant backgrounds, we come with that, right? And that gets carried over from generation to generation, that mentality. So my question to you is, given that, what steps can we do now to be able to break that generational trauma for things that are unproductive and be able to have conversations with people who are different than us and better understand individuals that come from different backgrounds, have different perspectives, but still live cohesively and be able to respect one another in this new society that we're all going to experience?
That's such a great question. We've got a lot to think about there, but let me answer by saying this. I'm going to give you two very specific policy solutions that can solve that. The problem with policy solutions is they're not immediate. So then I'm going to give you another concept that I'm working on that I think can address that. The first answer is you can get as many Latino kids into college as you possibly can. Literally, whether it's by individual scholarship or whether by massive policy changes to replicate the successes that you have had here at UC Irvine. Because that is ultimately the great equalizer, not just for Latinos, but for the rest of there's just as much value in white kids seeing Latinos as peers as there are Latinos seeing white kids as peers, okay? It's not just for Latinos, it's for everybody. One of the real problems I've had with California, and I've been a very vocal critic, is we are creating the most unequal society of any state in the union, faster than anywhere else. And at the top of the shrinking pyramid of wealth and homeownership are overwhelmingly white people, increasingly a little bit Asian, but at the bottom of this widening base of poverty and lack of homeownership are Latinos. That's a recipe for complete social disaster that has never ended well anywhere in the course of human history, ever, anywhere. And we are going down that road faster than anywhere, at any place in time, here in California, as a direct result of policy decisions. We created it, okay? Which means we can fix it, which takes me to the second policy solution. Get Latinos into homes, home ownership. We've got to stop this crisis of affordability in this state, because it's not just not being able to own a home. The social impacts and ramifications of this are extraordinary. We are creating a moneyed class of people that are demographically older, whiter, and more college educated, that have an actual stake in society, and we are adding onto that people who do not have equity, who do not have ownership of a completely different ethnicity, and that is dangerous. You see it manifest in low voter turnout rates, a lack of civic participation, slower rates of attending and graduating from higher education. I spoke to a group of children's hospitals last week in San Diego. 70% of Latino children in this state, 70 are on Medi-Cal. That's a poverty program. 70% of our children are on Medi-Cal. That's a sin, okay? And the bigger problem I have is that's a failing of our policymakers. That is addressable, but it's largely addressable by getting people into ownership of their community. When you become a homeowner, you are 300% more likely to vote. And we wonder why Latinos don't vote. There's demographic reasons. It's not our culture, okay? Voting is mandatory in Mexico. You have 100% voter turnout in Mexico, okay? So it's not like people come here and we don't have this. There's no truth to that. There's a lot that needs to be dispelled. But the third, which is this other piece, those are the two policy pieces. Get our kids into college and graduating, get them into homes, both of them very addressable by policymakers in the state. The other is we need to start, I just met with some Hollywood screenwriters yesterday to kind of help urge them as Latinos to start changing the nature of the characters of the way we perceive ourselves and the way the world perceives us. Because you can go to Hollywood tomorrow with a script about a narco trafficker
a gangbanger from East LA or somebody who's undocumented, and you can sell that series tomorrow. Because that's what the market, their market demands. You can't tell the story of somebody who's upwardly mobile aspirationally. You can't tell the story of somebody who was, let me give you a real specific example. Sorry about taking time here. But I'll wrap up on this, as I famously do. One of these Latinos was approached to write a series, to do a Netflix series on the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do this series, but we're going to tell it a different way. And the studio said, well, how are you going to tell it? He said, I'm going to tell the story of Gil Carrillo, the homicide investigator that tracked down Richard Ramirez, who was one of only 2 Latino homicide investigators that was a man who caught him. Now let's tell the story from that perspective. And thank God there was a Latino in there that came out with a different perspective, because the studio loved it. That's how they're going to tell the story. That's the way our stories need to be told. For our own kids, for our own sense of who we are. We can't just constantly be the narco trafficker, the undocumented, God bless them, we all respect them, that's not who we are proportionally, or a gangbanger. But that's what Hollywood wants and demands, because that's the story that they know they can sell and consume. We have to take control of our own narrative.
All right, speaking of narratives, how about another question? Right here.
Good morning. You had a comment when you said why you wrote your book, that you noticed it was a tense moment and that you were sad to see your party, the party that defends the Constitution and believes in rights. And comments like that, I think, could be clarified, because I would argue that Democrats also believe in the Constitution, are very patriotic. So my question is, I'm married to a Republican and I'm a Democrat. In your perspective, why have some Republicans frozen during this turmoil? And how is the Lincoln Project waking them up so that both parties can be healthy parties?
Yeah, just for clarification, I never said the Democrats were not believers in the Constitution. I never said that. I have never said that. I don't believe that. But I am a strict constructionist, as I would argue, as a political practitioner, and I believe that the party that I joined followed those lines better than the Democratic Party did. It's just my political opinion. We can disagree on that. It doesn't mean I don't believe that Democrats are anti-American. I believe wide swaths of the Republican Party are anti-American at this point. Okay? I do that, I believe. It's not all of them, no, but a wide swath. And that gets to answer your question, which is, how can people become complicit in what they know is obviously wrong? How do the people that I grew up with, a lot of them in Orange County for 30 years, arguing for a lot of these constitutional principles, somehow change and transform into something that is working diametrically opposed to what the party was? And the answer through a lot of struggle was, and I never understood this, as a young man, what I really wanted to study in my early 20s at Georgetown University, I could see the demographic change coming. And I wanted to be part of that. As a Gen Xer, my generation was going to be the first and perhaps only generation of Americans that would know a white majority America, and at the end of my career, a minority majority country. And being that bridge was something that I wanted to be a part of, because I knew America would fundamentally and foundationally change. And so I spent the better part of 20 years studying what that meant for Latinos. How would Latinos take over the American experiment? How could we as a people with a non-European Western tradition be the good or best stewards of this incredibly elegant solution that a bunch of white dudes in wigs in Philadelphia in the late 1700s gave us? Like, how is that going to be possible? The one thing I never really considered was that there would be a backlash from the shrinking white minority. Now, I don't mean to make that a broad swath, because there are a lot of people who don't believe that, but about half of us do. That America is not America unless it's a white nation. That's just absolutely, there's tons of correlative evidence. You have a president of the United States who's actively running on that right now, a nominee for the president of the United States running on that. So, the answer to the question is, how can you believe how can you say you believed in those principles
And yet when it's the exact opposite is presented with you, how can you enable it and support it and stand behind it? The answer in my mind is, it shows the power of, as much as we want to believe in the idea of America, we are still at some base fundamental level motivated by the same biological characteristics that have defined 99% of humanity, which is if you are not of my tribe, you are to be feared or to be scared of or to view as a threat. And what I argue in the book is the only difference between tribalism, which that is, and pluralism, which is a belief, a confident belief in diversity and a changing society that is not reflective of your own, is perspective. The only difference between tribalism and pluralism is if you believe this is a good thing and we're going to be better for it, you subscribe to pluralism. If you're afraid of it and become isolationist and protectionist and nativist, you become a tribalist. And that's my answer. That's the best answer I have.
I was kind of hoping you'd be provocative today.
Yeah.
Additional questions, and by the way, Mike has talked about the changing demographics. We have a number of students in the back. You get to ask questions as well. In fact, I hope you will, because as you know, classes begin a week from today. You got to get that muscle memory back. Yeah. But apparently, all right. So it looks like Professor Elizabeth Loftus has the microphone.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Nice to see you again. We met in the elevator. I have kind of a strange question for you. I was really fascinated by the description in the beginning of your talk about the gender gap and the widening gender gap. And I'm not sure you would know the answer to this question or whether you even want the conversation to go in this direction. But as a psychologist, I can't help but wonder what are the implications here for marital harmony and the divorce rate and other indications of disharmony in the families.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's one that I was first confronted with I did a podcast with a think tank called the Niskanen Center, and there's been a lot of work being done on this because there are a lot of arguments, I think, which have a lot of merit, which is as this gender divide and this gap between college-educated women and non-college-educated men grows, the disparity, not just in our politics, but socially, culturally, and the ability of our families to remain intact is increasingly coming under extraordinary, perhaps novel pressures. Look, I'm not going to suggest that Latinos will be any different there. They may or may not. I do believe very strongly that the closer we are to the immigrant experience, the more we hold on to, for whatever reasons, that those bonds of marriage, despite some of those economic pressures. But by that third generation, where ethnicity and race becomes a much weaker anchor than in those prior generations, and frankly, college education attendance rates go up significantly, we are going to see that same pressure. So I don't know if we will, quote unquote, assimilate into that same broader dynamic that we're seeing amongst all Americans. But what I will say is this is probably not exactly on topic, but it is something that alarms me greatly. We have a crisis right now with men. And I say it's a crisis because young men with no purpose and don't feel that they have a functional role in society and feel, perspective is reality in my business, that they are not wanted, become violent. And we are witnessing in this country something that is really unique to us throughout the Western world. The rate at which we see mass shootings, our suicide rate, our opioid addiction rates, things like anorexia, self-harm activity, the mental health crisis, they are not specific to white Americans, but they're largely concentrated amongst white Americans. And we are witnessing what I believe is symptomatic of a people who believe that they are in decline. And people in a society that believe they are in decline become either outwardly violent or inwardly
violent. And this self-destructive behavior is going to increasingly become a characteristic of this country. It already is. Europeans are like, you guys, they believe every American is strapped and ready to shoot everybody at any one time. I mean, my God, we have metal detectors at every school. We have, you do it here, I think, probably. You do shooting drills. That these social characteristics of self-harm and external harm are largely characteristics of the United States. You don't see much of these same dynamics in Western Europe. There's some of it probably growing a little bit for some of the same pressures, but in the United States of America, you are seeing it at alarming rates. They're all correlated. And a lot of this is male-dominated, male-focused. We will see the largest gender gap in this November's elections at any time in recorded history, in large part because we have the parties speaking directly to each gender. Democrats are leaning very, 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 very hard into the female demographic in an attempt to increase turnout. Donald Trump is doing it equally as strenuously to men. And we are finding ourselves, unfortunately, increasingly divided, and the institution of family is changing. It has been changing for decades. I think it's going to accelerate considerably. I think Latinos can be the glue for that for a certain amount of time, but I don't think it can, it's a permanent change in large part because ethnicity is not, ethnicity is far more fluid than we have ever recognized, and we're going to learn that more as we become a more diverse society.
All right, another question. Why don't we come up front to the honorary mayor, Sandra.
Thank you for that.
The microphone's just over your
I don't
shoulder.
need it. My voice carries. First of all, congratulations, Mike, on the book. I had the opportunity of reading your book.
Thank you.
And you touched on disinformation, misinformation. I'd like for you to touch on one subject that I have been trying to get my customers. I have a business in downtown Santana, and I am doing my best, my sister and I, to register our customers or help them register. I give them this little thing from Cal State Fullerton, and UCI is also doing it. But anyway, this is what I'm getting from the women especially. They're not voting, okay? And I said, why? Well, we don't like Trump and we don't like Vice President Harris. And I said, why? And then they give me this, that Harris is killing babies and Trump is this and that. And I recall back when Hillary Clinton ran that they were saying that she was a pedophile. These same customers.
Yeah.
And where are they getting this from? From the Russian trolls? From, I don't know. And I asked them, where my friend told me this. But it's every day that I'm getting this. And I'm saddened to hear this because, I mean, what's going on? They're not going to vote or they don't know, who they're voting for yet. So can you just touch that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think in the book I brought it up with a woman named Evelyn who's in Florida where it's particularly pronounced. But let me kind of put it in context because anytime there's conscious misinformation campaigns, we need to be very aware of them and seek to stamp them out and stop them. The vast majority of orchestrated, sophisticated misinformation campaigns are coming from our foreign enemies. They are not domestically produced. These are very, and I saw this when I was on the Lincoln Project in 2020. What I was seeing was weapons grades communication strategies. These were militarized, very, very sophisticated efforts. This wasn't just a bunch of Republican hacks sitting in there, over their coffee table coming up with, black hat, tricks. This is very sophisticated, very well-resourced, very orchestrated. But, and I don't want to diminish those because they are having an effect, but this is very important. The bigger problem with misinformation affecting Latinos is overwhelmingly on English mediums. It's the Fox News problem. There are far more Latinos watching Fox News than there are WhatsApp channels, okay? And there's another stereotype I want to break here. This might be very fascinating. Just as I mentioned that migratory levels are dropping and the third generation numbers are exploding, you're seeing groups like Univision and Telemundo under deep, deep pressure. Their markets are collapsing, okay?
The Spanish-speaking audience is less than 20% of our voters. Our voters, the population might be bigger, but of our voters, 80% of Latinos are getting communication almost entirely in English. You will hear there's a lot of bilingual stuff. Most of that comes from the media companies trying to keep their market alive. In terms of voting behavior, it's 80% Latino, or English. So the big problem, if we're really focused on misinformation as we should be, is not on Spanish WhatsApp channels, although that is true, or Facebook or the social media channels, that's true. There's a much, much bigger problem on English mediums targeting not just our community, but all communities. It's a very, very big pervasive problem.
Right in front here. Microphone will be right over your shoulder.
Arnold Gutierrez, I'm Orange County Alliance member. I'm fourth generation Latino. When I look at my nieces and nephews who are fifth generation, about half of them are 100% Latino. The other half are mixed Latino white. And so I wonder if you will comment on that specific demographic. Do they identify as Latino? Are there perspectives in line with a lot of what you reported? Are they divergent?
That's the million-dollar question, and I'll tell you why. By the third generation, our interracial marriage rates exceed 50%. In other words, as a Latino, you're more likely to marry outside of Latino than within Latinos. We have the highest interracial marriage rates with African Americans, Asians, and whites. For Latinos, we're interracial marriage with everybody. Do what you will with that comment. But we are, and by definition, we are a blended people. We are blended culture people. The whole definition of Latino is we are part indigenous and part European, right? So that to me makes us the glue that is going to hold all of this together. The question is, have we been politically identifying what Latino means in a way that is unhealthy for the policymaking process and for the maturation of our community and the media perspectives of who we are? Do you understand what I'm saying? I would argue, yes, we absolutely have. The Latino caucus in California up here, and I'm talking to them all the time. Okay, they know what I'm about to say, so I'm not going to be offended. Having breakfast with the chairman next week. They only allow Democrats in the Latino Legislative Caucus in California. For the past 50 years, Republicans are not allowed. We're the only caucus in the entire country, Latino and Hispanic caucus, that does that. Because that's how important the need to define Latinidad with a political party is. I have no doubt a lot of this is the vestiges of 187, but 50 years meant 20 years before 187 we were doing this. And it's a horrible thing for our community. It's a horrible thing because it means that part of your Latino identity is partisan. I mean, I can't think of anything more destructive for democracy, let alone for our community. And I think there's finally, after 50 years, a realization that maybe we as a party don't have all the solutions, and maybe this is not helpful to the community or even us politically. And that's why I'm having breakfast with them, saying, let's try and break it up. By the way, the first time I sat down with them was in 1998, when 4 Latinos were elected to the state legislature, and everyone was like, how can there be Latino Republicans? It's like a unicorn, right? We all heard about them, but they're not really real, are they? And now when you start to see 37, 38% of Latinos, almost 40% are voting for Republicans, there's a political awakening going, wait a second, maybe our whole conceptions have been wrong. And when I've told a young man at my alma mater, Oak Park College, at a book signing, he asked me the same question as a 20-year-old Latino man, saying, I see people in my family who lean heavily into their Latino identity and others who kind of deny it. I don't know where I belong. My answer to him was, your Latinidad is as legitimate as anybody else's. If you don't speak Spanish, that has nothing to do with your ethnicity. If you're not Catholic, it has nothing to do with your ethnicity. If you're not a Democrat, that has nothing to do with your ethnicity.
Your experience and where you came from and your representation of your culture is all that matters. How you manifest that is entirely up to you. And so, yeah, that's why we're seeing such dramatic change with Latinidad and Latino political behavior, and it is challenging the whole notion of what a minority voter is. We want to believe desperately for some, I know why, I was gonna say for some peculiar reason, it all goes back to our formative understanding of the black-white relationship of race in this country that existed for 250 years as a country and 200 years prior to that. In fact, the first chapter of my book is called Beyond Black and White, because that understanding of race no longer works in a pluralistic society. So, yes, we account for that, but as we're finding in our research here at UC Irvine, School of Social Ecology, factors like education and college educational attainment levels are perhaps more definitive features than the racial and ethnic identity. Even though you may be voting with the same party for the same candidates, you're approaching them very different reasons and rationale. That doesn't make anybody more or less Latino.
So let's see, do any of the students have a question? There's one of you must. Come on, make us proud. All right, here we go. This will be over with the microphone in just a moment.
Earlier, you stressed the importance of Latinos in higher education. As a Latina, sometimes I feel that I am not represented specifically in my field of study, and just for context, I'm in the computer science department.
Computer science?
Yeah, so what advice would you give to Latinos who do not feel represented in their institution and may even feel discouraged to continue their education?
That's such a powerful question. In fact, one of the reasons why I started down this journey of study when I was Mexicano here in Ventura County, graduated from high school in the late 1980s. Nobody did the math on that. But I went to an East Coast school, and I was in classrooms with people that had never met a Mexican American before. Which sounds very peculiar now in this country, but back then that was not uncommon on the East Coast or in the South or in the Northeast. And I felt very isolated and very alone. And it made me question a lot of who we were, because in California specifically, there's a lot of seamlessness except for at the top of our institutions, higher education being one of them, particularly in STEM. Okay, less than 5% of STEM graduates are Latino, specifically Latina. Latinos generally, Latinas are even smaller. So you are that unicorn that we have found, and I'm proud of you, sister, for what you're doing, because it's not easy. Let me talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, because sometimes that is what's part of our alienation. The tool that I learned at Georgetown when I was there with very wealthy kids who were 6th or 7th generation Georgetown, got into there for a very different type of affirmative action than I probably got in there. Was what I realized was, as much as I kept asking myself, what am I doing here? The more that I got to know the students around me, the more I started to ask the question, what are they doing here? I'm smart or smarter than at least half of these kids, in most cases, most of these kids. And that, I don't know if that helps, but it was just one of the tools that I used to be like, none of you all here in this class, when I was there, no one was raised in a poor, struggling, working class family where their parents had never gone to college before like I had. They were literally vacationing in Europe, during spring break. Hey, can you go to Italy with us? We should all go hang out. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I gotta find a way to sneak into the dorms when they're closed because I don't have a place to stay, let alone travel home or anywhere, right? And those are our stories. But never forget that you are here for a reason. You belong here, and you are creating and forging a path for the people behind you that will become more commonplace, especially in STEM. And sister, I wish I could tell you it's going to get easier if you go into the sciences. It's not. What you're learning right now, you're forging the strength
to go into the hard sciences where there's not going to be a lot of Latinas. You're probably going to know all of each other across companies and with associations. And with if it's of any comfort, the fight that you're fighting is forging a new path to make it easier for people to come behind you. Okay? You belong here. Believe that. Do it.
I am tempted to end things there, but I'm going to take the deeply prerogative of asking you one more question.
I'll be around for questions too.
So you said earlier this is the first election campaign in forever that you have not been working for a candidate. So let me finish with a question that allows you to put your political hat on and offer advice. So this book, by the way, is really, really readable, and I've enjoyed reading it. And in the chapter where you talk about your movement into the Lincoln Project and your disillusionment with what you saw happening in your former party, you say that Donald Trump disqualified himself with Latinos the day he announced his candidacy when he disparaged Mexican Americans. And then you give other examples of situations where he's done that. And yet, as I read you on Twitter, or X or whatever we're calling it these days, you're saying he's performing fairly well among Latino voters to a point where you find it surprising. So kind of two questions. Number one, how is that possible?
Yeah.
And two, if you were advising the Harris campaign, what would you be telling them to do?
Yeah, great question. So let me answer by saying this. First of all, thank you again for coming at a morning breakfast to hear this kind of talk. But by the nature of your coming here, I want you to understand you're not the normal voter. Normal voters don't do this. Okay? They're not coming to hear this kind of discussion and talk and analysis and get to the roots of why things are happening. I believe, and I provide a lot of evidence in the book, that this shift to the right, and it's really not a shift, it's the emergence of a new vote, because a shift assumes that Latinos were voting one way and are now changing their voting behavior. That's not what's happening. It's these younger, newer people with less voting history voting differently than we expect them to. Those are two very different things. These voters are voting for populist reasons because the political system does not make sense to them, it does not work for them, and it has failed them. And they see very clearly as young people what a lot of people my age and older are just finally coming to the realization of, which is these two parties are just absurdly part of a deeply, profoundly broken system, and everyone's just playing a game. They get it. They get it. Okay? And I've worked on both sides of the aisle. I'm one of a handful of people that has worked at the highest levels on both sides. I did the Lincoln Project, a very unique perch. I've seen it. It's both parties. Okay, it is. So, let's get to the question. How is it possible that Latinos are voting more and more Republican than for Donald Trump specifically? I'm going to answer it this way. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, Republican Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, Doug Ducey, the former Republican governor of Arizona, Brian Dawley. We know who Brian Dawley was? The Republican sacrificial lamb who ran against, no one even knows in California, or Orange County, the Republican sacrificial lamb that ran against Gavin Newsom in the 2020 midterms. Every single Republican who represents a swing House district in the entire country, all of those politicians, all those Republican politicians have one thing in common. And that one thing is they either met or exceeded Donald Trump's support levels with Latino voters. That's extraordinarily strong evidence to suggest that they're not moving because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is actually preventing a bigger shift that would naturally be happening because of the reasons I outlined in the book. This is a demographic shift, it's an economic shift, and it's a populist shift. If Donald Trump were not in this race, another more reasonable nominee would be getting over 40% of the Latino votes. Okay? That's what's happening. I'll end it on this, one of the last points. the populism, the anti, and as I mentioned, and I think made a strong case for this confidence and trust that Latinos have in all social institutions, there are two very significant exceptions. The Democratic and Republican Party. This has profound impacts on democracy. In many of the same precincts where Donald Trump saw this rightward shift of Latinos, Bernie Sanders won in the Democratic primary. There's a populist transformation that is happening in our community because there is no confidence in the political parties to solve the problems that afflict us. I would argue for very, very good reasons. They're not. They're neither trying to solve our problems nor are they succeeding. So, as I say in the book, I said earlier on a radio show today, Republicans are winning more and more Latino votes despite their efforts, not because of them. With that, let's talk some folks.
Wonderful. Well, in my experience, there are very few people in the public sphere who truly match the hype. Mike is one of those people, and I hope you will join me in thanking him for being with us this morning. This is not the last that you will see of Mike with his affiliation with the School of Social Ecology. We are already in conversations about potentially creating a Center for the Future of California here, and Mike will play a role in that. But for the remainder of this morning's session, Mike will be right over here signing books for you, so please come line up and have a conversation with Mike. And with that, thank you again to the Alliance for helping to co-host this, and thank you, Mike, for being here.